So, to put these ideas in practice, I want to draw an example from Scott Odell's children's novel, Island of the Blue Dolphins. Island of the Blue Dolphins fictionalizes the story of the lone woman of San Nicolas Island, a California, quote, Indian, end quote, who remained on her natal island in relative isolation for 18 years after the rest of her people were removed to the mainland. Odell's children's book draws from the historical accounts of the lone woman and, in doing so, perpetuates the myth that many California Indians became extinct during the 1800s. This concept, as we now know, is the concept of the disappearing or the vanishing Indian, and it is present in many historical accounts of the lone woman that claim she was the quote last of her race, end quote. We now know definitively that this claim is false. There is evidence that at least one other Nicolino, and he was baptized by the name Thomas, but he is still Nicolino, outlived the lone woman. And there are likely others. The narrative of the United States history that is taught in most schools is itself that of the vanishing Indian. History students from elementary school to high school generally learn about the Native Americans in the fall in relation to the arrival of the first European settlers and around the Thanksgiving holiday. And then Indigenous people seem to disappear for most of the rest of the year. Indigenous peoples are spoken of in the past tense, perpetuating the idea that Indigenous peoples vanished in the past. This is a newspaper account that was published in the San Francisco Daily Herald on November 13th, 1853, shortly after the lone woman's death in Santa Barbara, California. In the family of Mr. George Niediver, she lived very contentedly and apparently gratified with the change. She was evidently much pleased by the novel sights which were presented to her, in horses and other large animals. She ate freely of many things which were given to her, and seemed particularly fond of shellfish, coffee, liquor, and fruits. But her system was unused to such a diet, and after too free an indulgence, she sickened and died on the 18th of October. She was undoubtedly the last of her race. So while they state that the lone woman was the last of her race, indeed one of these disappearing Indians that they had so many fallacies about, they're also very careful to blame her for her own death once she did integrate into American society. It was not the diseases she encountered, it was not perhaps poor living conditions. It sounded like she worked as a laborer for this Mr. George Niediver. And also, this reference to liquor is very interesting, as if they are almost trying to say that she developed some form of alcohol abuse issue, and this somehow led to her to sicken and die of her own hand. Of course, we know that colonial trauma and its impacts are much more complex than could ever be stated in this statement, and we can't ever know or hope to imagine what the lone woman went through in the last years of her life that led her to become sick and die. And perhaps the resistance to depict her as flawed or these projects of American progress as flawed were also tied up in the inherent romanticism of the narrative of the imaginary Indian itself. So I'll read you a section from the first edition of Scott Odell's novel, and it's a author note that often appears alongside, still to this day. The girl Robinson Crusoe, whose story I have attempted to recreate, actually lived alone upon this island from 1835 to 1853 and is known to history as the last woman, or the lost woman rather, of San Nicolas. The facts known about her are few. From the reports of Captain Hubbard, whose schooner carried away the Indians of Galisat, we know that the girl did jump into the sea despite efforts to restrain her. From records left by Captain Nidiver, we know that he found her 18 years later, alone with a dog in a crude house on the headland, dressed in a skirt and a cormorant feathers. Father Gonzalez of Santa Barbara Mission, who befriended her after her rescue, learned that her brother had been killed by wild dogs. He learned little else, for she spoke to him in only signs. Neither he nor many Indians at the mission could understand her strange language. The Indians of Galisant had long since, quote, disappeared, end quote. So we can see Odell's own fascination with this idea of the lost woman as this perfect narrative for the disappearing or the vanishing Indian, and also one that does align with the ideologies of conquest, of feminized land, of the conquerable West, of man, white man himself ordained with the right and power of God to conquer all land in the Americas. It's an interesting and exciting narrative, and one wherein they're very careful to never give her any sense of agency. They always view her with a sense of voyeurism, but never wanting to know more about what actually happened to her or her community. And in fact, they're very cagey to actually give details or insight into what did happen to her entire community. She is one of the last peoples of this community to exist in her territory at the time. Something traumatic, something terrible had to have happened, but there's little reference to it in this author's note. It's as if her past community, her own oral history, who she was before she was met by these would-be Americans, is completely erased by the intentions of these white men who want to conquer her. And this is precisely how the Indian maiden narrative is always repurposed. It's always used again and again throughout history. This Indian maiden, her face is constantly shifting, but she always represents the same thing. She represents white colonist men's right and their desire to colonize and continue to exert settler colonialism over the territories in the Americas.